Be time at the end of the meeting. There will be time at the end of the meeting for fellowship and to share contact information. This meeting will be recorded. So hello, everyone. For this meeting, participants will be muted and the chat will be disabled. At the end of the meeting, instructions will be given on how to unmute and chat will be enabled so newcomers and sponsors can leave their information. We will now get started. So welcome to our Al-Anon Big Book Recovery Qualification meeting. Today is Tuesday, January 20th, 2026, and it's 5:30 p.m. Eastern. My name is Megan D. I am a recovered Al-Anon, and I am your speaker for this evening. Tonight, I will share what I used to be like, what happened, and what I'm like now. In order to set the tone for this meeting, I ask that we bow our heads in a few moments of silent prayer and meditation, followed by the Serenity Prayer. Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thy will, not mine, be done. So again, my name is Megan D. I'm a recovered Al-Anon, and I will tell you that my story doesn't fit with what I thought the typical Al-Anon story would be, because I never would have thought myself to be an Al-Anon. Now, there is alcoholism in my family history. I'm going back in the lineage. I've been told that my grandparents on both sides, my maternal grandparents, my paternal grandparents, both had issues with alcohol. And so I knew that was there, but it never directly affected me. I didn't see it. I wasn't aware of it when I was a child. I didn't think it was anything that had an impact on my development or my mental state. I did know, however, that I struggled with compulsive eating throughout my life. I was a yo-yo dieter. I would compulsively binge eat and lose control. And then at some point, I would make a resolution, I'm never going to do this again. And my mind would take me back to it. And I would relapse back into my compulsive eating. And I was stuck in this vicious cycle, just like the alcoholic. But for me, it was compulsive eating. And that actually escalated to the point where I was on my knees. I was desperate. I felt hopeless. I didn't know what to do. And it drove me into a 12-step program. I found recovery from my compulsive eating. I still didn't think alcohol had any effect in my life. I knew I was a compulsive eater. I knew that I was like the alcoholic when it came to my compulsive eating, but I didn't see any other parallels. I didn't see any impact of alcoholism on me. So I got recovered for compulsive eating. I was going on about my life. I was living in steps 10, 11, and 12, working a spiritual program. I had a lot of neutrality around my compulsive eating. And I realized that I wasn't neutral when it came to my relationships. And actually, my sponsor, I had two sponsors for compulsive eating, and both ended up leaving the program. Like I worked with one for a couple years and she left program. I worked with another for a couple years. She had some other ideas, left program. And my third sponsor for compulsive eating, that's what I approached her for. She happens to be a dual sponsor. And she had experience with not only the compulsive eating, but also Al-Anonism. And she was the first, and she had been my grand sponsor for all the years prior. So, for maybe 4 years or so or more, she had been my grand sponsor. I had learned a lot of things from my sponsor that were passed down from her. But this new sponsor uh, was the first person who told me that I was still controlling people, that I was fighting people, that I wasn't, there was something missing. And that caused me to really take a pause Um, it actually caused a lot of fear in me because I didn't know what I could be missing. I didn't understand it. It was so confusing. But she was right that while I had recovery and neutrality around compulsive eating and my food and body issues, I did not have emotional sobriety. I did not feel neutral when it came to my relationships. And so I had to take a mental deep dive into what my life had looked like up to that point. And I recognized the Al-Anonism that had been creeping along and showing up in my relationships without me even realizing it. The codependency and the obsession. And I realized that even though I did not have an active alcoholic in my life, even though I had no conscious awareness of alcoholism during my childhood, I had been impacted by alcohol in a very real way. And I started to think through what was going on. So, first, clearly, in my grandparents, there were issues of alcohol. I saw how that had affected my parents and our interactions. But what was going on with me in my relationships? When I was a young child, I wanted to be the peacemaker. It was very unsettling for me when there was conflict in the family. And I was the baby of the family. So my older sister is about 5 years older. My older brother is 8 years older. And so they were going into their teenage years long before, I hit that stage of life. And there was conflict with my parents, between siblings and parents. There was conflict between my parents, between my father and mother. And some of it was normal stuff. Other conflict was caused by substance abuse issues. My brother had some substance abuse issues. There were behavioral issues. And in any case, it was very unsettling for me. And I tried to control those situations by being the peacemaker. I wanted them to get along with each other so that I felt comfortable and secure. Of course, that wasn't my role. I was the baby of the family. I was a young child. It was not my place to control and manage those relationships and try to get my family members to get along. Um, but that's what I naturally fell into. And over the years, I just settled into this role of being a people pleaser, that I wanted people to like me. I wanted to have a certain image. I never thought of myself as being controlling, but I now understand that control can be very kind of overt in your face, like being pushy and demanding and telling people what to do and managing or micromanaging. But control can also be very subtle. It can be the people pleasing, like withholding opinions, trying to blend into the background, trying to get people to like me, agreeing to do things that I don't really want to do. When we try to control relationships in that way, we're basically saying we don't trust God, that I didn't trust God that I would be okay if people didn't like me. I didn't trust that I would be okay if I didn't have their friendship or if they didn't think well of me, if they had a poor opinion of me. I didn't trust that I would be okay. And so, in order to feel secure and safe, I would try to manage that relationship in a way, doing what I thought people wanted me to do, saying what I thought people wanted me to say. I tried to be the person that I thought other people liked. And that was control. That was very often how my control and my Al-Anonism showed up in my young adulthood of just craving the approval, trying to get my self-esteem from other people, my sense of self-worth, and just, wanting to feel secure. And that security was based on other people's opinions, what they thought of me, how those relationships went. And, yes, sometimes I was pushing, demanding, and I was like, would have a bad attitude. I would go off on people, but very often, that control was like being really, really nice, nice in a fake way. And that played out in my friendships throughout grade school into my young adulthood. I had there's a friend here and there, but none of those friendships were authentic until I found recovery. Because throughout my young adulthood, I was always playing a role. I was being an actor. I was putting on a show for people, what they wanted to see. And so I never had really deep, intimate friendships because I didn't let people see me, the true me. And there's a vulnerability in that, letting people see the good and the bad, and not only, the positive traits, but my flaws. And I didn't have the security to be that vulnerable with my friends. And so I always felt like I was on the outside, even though I could play this role and I could show up to parties and, social occasions and I could be there. There was always something in me that felt off, like I didn't belong, I didn't fit in, I wasn't a part of it. I might have been doing the same activities. I might have been doing the exact same things that the other people are doing, playing the board game or watching the movie or, having a conversation with them. But I never felt like I was truly a part of it because I was just there of this actor, this show. And so throughout my young adulthood, there was this deep sense of loneliness. I always felt like I was missing something, insecure, low self-esteem. And I would do the people pleasing. And then once I started dating, I was just a clinger. Yeah, I would start dating someone and I would get obsessed. I would get wrapped up in that person. I would make that person my everything, trying to get the validation and the security and the self-esteem and trying to get all that I felt like I needed from that other person. But I couldn't make healthy decisions in those relationships. And what I didn't understand then, and I do understand now, is how the Al-Anonism was affecting that in my, like the codependent decisions I would make in those relationships of obsessing about the other person and worrying about what they thought or being overly involved, suffocating. And my relationships weren't healthy. I tried desperately to have healthy relationships, but there was always some way that I would muddle it up. And I I found it increasingly more difficult over the years to have healthy, faithful relationships. I was getting progressively worse in my Al-Anonism. And now I understand that this is a progressive spiritual malady. So, every time I would have a bad relationship and I felt like I had bottomed out, maybe I would make some changes short term, but then I would go back into a new relationship and I found ways to bottom out even further and make even worse decisions. Um, I was found myself, even though I didn't think I was a bad person. And even though I always felt like I was in the right. I always felt like the problem was the other person. Like the problem was the boyfriend or the ex-boyfriend or, this guy did this and that guy said that. and I was pointing fingers. I felt like they were the problem. And now I see I was the common denominator because I was showing up in these relationships and I was very manipulative. I'm not a bad person, but I was so spiritually sick that I would manipulate these relationships, trying to get what I felt like I needed and what I wanted. And there was this ever present obsession that's very characteristic of Al-Anonism, this obsession around the people and the relationships. And I would just find myself thinking about these people I was dating, what they're doing or not doing. And, are they thinking about me? Or I would play out conversations. You could sit me in a room and I could just think about a scenario and a relationship. And it's, if you've ever read these choose your own adventure books, where it's like you read a page and it says, if you want to break up with the guy, go to page 7. If you want to stay together with him, go to page 13. And you go to the next page and it gives you a different scenario. And you kind of choose your own adventure as you go through to the end of the book. And that's how it was in my relationships, that I just didn't have clarity or guidance. There was always this self-serving aspect of trying to get what I needed. Um, and it got progressively worse, and my relationships felt very unhealthy, and not just in dating, but in my family. Going back to my family of origin, where I had issues of alcoholism, which again, I never thought that alcoholism was relevant. It felt so far in the past that I didn't think I could be an Al-Anon. But I started to realize how the family can get sick. When an alcoholic is sick, it's a spiritual malady, and the family can get sick as well. And I saw how my family members had become spiritually sick, and I saw how I had become spiritually sick. It's this tug of war where we're trying to get what we want, what we think we need. So, anyways, this is all culminating up to the point where I had already found recovery from my compulsive eating, um, but I was struggling in my marriage. And my husband was the first person I had dated after I got recovered from my compulsive eating. And we had dated for a couple of years, and then we got married. And I just was so irritable around my husband. Just, in other relationships, I had issues. I had issues with the people pleasing with my coworkers, and I had people pleasing with family members, and I could be pushy. But that intimate relationship with my husband was just like always kind of prickly, just never felt satisfied. I was always a little bit irritable, restless, discontent. And um, it was definitely, my relationship had improved through the spiritual principles that I was already applying. Because I was working a 12-step program for compulsive eating, I was making better choices. Whereas in the past, when I had no recovery of any kind, I was just kind of wild. Like I was doing things that I shouldn't have been doing. I was acting out, and I was having a hard time being faithful in my relationships. And so now, like coming back to my husband, I wasn't acting out selfishly in the way that I had been in the past, but my mind was so unsettled. And I'm convinced if I hadn't started working a 12-step program for my Al-Anonism, that I would be divorced. There's no way. And not because of anything he had done, but because I was spiritually sick and I didn't have a real solution. I didn't understand my Al-Anonism. And until you understand the problem, you can't apply the solution. And that's what's so key. And that's why step 1 is so important, because I knew what my problem was for compulsive eating, so the solution worked. I had the problem and the solution, and they worked. And I knew that, there were other 12-step programs, but I did not understand Al-Anonism at a heart level. And so I was still restless, irritable, and discontent in my relationships. And when my sponsor told me, because, I was going through and I had all these 10 steps around my husband, and I was annoyed that he was doing this, and I was annoyed that he was doing that. And, there was this obsession with what he was doing or not doing. And I was feeling like life wasn't treating me right. And when she said that that I was controlling him, um, well, first, my ego is a little bit bruised, but whenever you have a chance to have your ego bruised, thank God for that, because that's how we are humbled and we need humility. But I had to take a look at that, at my marriage, and I recognized that I was controlling him. I was obsessive about how he spent his time. I was clingy. He would maybe go out once a week or every so often with a friend. And that was very unsettling for me. I had a hard time being apart from him. He would go out and then I would feel lonely and left behind. I would feel neglected. I would micromanage his affairs, like how he did his day-to-day activities, like when he brushed his teeth or whether or not he flossed. I was just overly involved. And here's this adult man who has a good job, he's earning a strong income, he's providing for the household, and I am treating him like this little child, you controlling him. And it just wasn't working. It felt like I was trying to white knuckle the relationship. Um, and we weren't happy. I wasn't happy. And I realized that the problem ultimately lied within me. And I was the common denominator. I looked back at all those past relationships, and I was bringing a spiritually sick person to those relationships. And I saw that in my marriage and in how much I was frustrated with my husband. And, it was important for me to understand that, like, sure, there's going to be differences, and sometimes there's friction in marriage or in relationships. But for me, it was just so often throughout the day. And I recognized, so step one is that we admitted we were powerless over alcohol and that our lives had become unmanageable. And there's this unmanageability where our mind will take us back into these things that we swear off of, like the Al-Anon way of thinking, or the behaviors, or the codependency. And I saw that all of that was ultimately stemming back from the spiritual sickness of alcoholism in my family. And that, even when I tried to improve my relationships, I would make these firm resolutions, like I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And I would try to make resolutions, and then it would feel like I just can't stick to it. I can't make it work. So even though I would try to be a better person or a better wife or a better friend or a better child or whatever, I would break my resolutions, and I would get obsessive, and I would nitpick, and I would nag, and I would complain, and I would people please. There are people I wasn't authentic with. I would people please. And I didn't know how to break out of that cycle until I truly recognized at a heart level the impact of alcohol and alcoholism in my family and on me. And I recognized that I just have this Al-Anon way of thinking. There's this codependency and the obsession. And for me, that very much shows up in just controlling and managing relationships. And some people, they may see it in a very obvious way, like if they have an alcoholic husband or an alcoholic child. And for me, it took so long to recognize that because the alcohol seemed far removed. Um, there was a lot of noise between then and now. Once I recognized it, and it was just so obvious that how I think's not normal. The way that I just naturally am such a sensitive person, the way that I will naturally fall into this control and trying to manage, the way that I will naturally worry about people and just like be anxious and try to fix problems. Sometimes I try to fix problems that don't even exist. I will completely create this story in my mind of a problem that I have to fix. And with people's emotions, I can create a story in my mind that somebody's mad at me. And then I will worry about it. And I will worry about why they're mad at me and how I can fix that. And maybe in reality, they're not mad at me at all, but I create that story. And that is what my mind is very good at doing. And that's something that I didn't know how to solve on my own. But once I recognized that and I recognized the unmanageability that my mind could not manage the decision to stop, dragging me back into it, and then the powerlessness of losing control with that way of thinking and losing control of myself and how much I just naturally want to control other people in my relationships. That was my step one. And I really had to suffer in my relationships and I had to try and fail. And I recognized that some people can do the things that are out there, like therapy or self-help books or workshops, and they can find personal improvement. They can, address some relationship issues and move forward. But I could not change my thinking with any of the methods that I had tried. Like my mind will just default back to this Al-Anonic way of thinking, despite my best efforts. And I suffered with that for a long time. But once I understood that step one at a heart level, step two was about having some hope. And yeah, I had grown up with God in my life, and I recognized that there are a lot of people who come into 12-step programs and they're agnostic or atheists. God's not really a part of their life. And others do have a faith background. I was one of those people who had grown up in a church. I had attended, church services quite frequently, regularly. And yet, even though I believed in God, it was clear to me that I was not relying on God. And on that, in that sense, we're all on the same page. We all come here not relying on a higher power. And I was not relying on God in my relationships. I was not relying on God and the choices I was making and how I was showing up for the people in my life. I was relying on myself, and that's why I was suffering. I was trying, all through my young adulthood and the different people I had dated, and it was always me trying to fix me trying to fix my relationships. And when I came into a 12-step program, I had some hope that if I worked this program, if I really lived a life of spiritual principles and I was disciplined in these principles, that God could do for me what I had seen happen for others. I read through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I read some of the stories. I talked to recovered sponsors, recovered Al-Anon sponsors, and heard their story and their experience. And I had hope that if I worked this program, then God could give me relief. And And really, it's just about believing or being willing to believe in a power greater than ourselves. And, I certainly did. But I also had that hope that if I continued forward, that there was a better way. And then step three was about making a decision, turning our wills and lives over to the care of God as we understand Him. Um, Turning my will and life over to God meant my thoughts and my actions, turning it all over on a daily basis. And that means in everything, not just in our personal relationships. It would be easy to say, okay, I'm going to come in and, work the steps around this alcoholic, or I'm going to come in and apply spiritual principles with my spouse or with my child. But what I've learned is that it's kind of an all or nothing. It's like we have to turn it all over to our higher power, or there's still self-will and we're going to suffer. And that was my experience, because I had already found recovery around my compulsive eating, and yet I was still suffering. And I had not turned my relationships, I had not turned the rest over to God. In my Al-Anonism, I recognized that I truly had to turn to God, um, with my family, with my husband, and my friendships, and in our careers, and uh, whatever brings us into the community, we have to be willing to turn that over to God. Um, and step three, just to boil it down really simply, is about making a decision. Because if we knew how to turn our will and life over to God, if we just naturally could do that, we would not need a 12-step program. And, I've seen people in my life who just radiate joy. You look at them and there's something different. They just naturally have something. And perhaps that's their blessing. They're like their grace that they just they're connected with their higher power. I didn't know how to be connected. I wanted to be, but I didn't know how to be. So step three is that decision to get connected with a recovered sponsor, which is someone who's had a spiritual awakening as a result of working the steps. And then you ask that person to guide you through. And as you work the steps, you learn how to turn your will and life over to that higher power. Um, so it's not, something that you're expected to know how to do. It's just a decision. Step one's the hard part. We do that before we get here. I had to mess around with my relationships. I had to like control people and manage the relationships. I did a lot of obsessing, a lot of worrying, a lot of people pleasing, a lot of fixing, and then we give up on ourselves. And then step two is coming here and having some hope, and step three is making that decision to do it. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to work the program. And I was able to, it was, thank God I had the willingness to see what I needed to see, and to accept my Al-Anonism and all the ways that it was manifesting, because I was willing then to work the program around all that other stuff that I had been leaving out and not trusting God with and not turning to my higher power. I was willing to work the steps around that. And so then step four was making an inventory and looking at what I was holding on to. So for those who are new and not familiar, it's looking at specifically resentments, fears, and sex conduct. Those are the three that are mentioned in the big book. But we're looking for that selfishness and self-centeredness in all the ways that it manifests. Because our real problem is just that. Our real problem is the defects that we're holding on to. In my Al-Anonism, I was essentially seeking a solution and trying to get ease and comfort from people. I was trying to get my sense of self-worth from my relationships and from, the people in my life. I was trying to get my self-esteem. But, what was driving me to that was what I was holding on to within myself. And my own selfishness and self-centeredness was making me restless, irritable, and discontent. And that showed up in my fears very strongly. Fears keep us stuck in the future. We're afraid of what we might lose or what we won't get that we think we need or what we want. And so I was wrapped up in my fears, which are inherently selfish because, um, it's about relying on self rather than trusting my higher power to provide. But I was also stuck in the past in my resentments and just rethinking, replaying, reliving things that had happened in my relationships and, playing the victim or feeling self-righteous. There's lots of ego and feeling um, like I've been wronged and that, it's their fault and just being very self-righteous. And just the morbid reflection around things that had happened that I felt hurt by. And that's inherently selfish because think of all the time that we can spend just mulling over these harms, whether they're real or imagined. Sometimes we have actually been hurt, but I know in my case, there were a lot of times that I just thought about, like I could create these situations in my mind where I felt hurts or I felt like I had been wronged, and it actually wasn't true at all. It was like some story I'd been telling myself. I didn't know the facts of the situation. And so I had to take a look at resentments, fears, and my sex conduct and look at where the selfishness was showing up in those. Um, and then step 5 was about doing that inventory, going through it with my sponsor and having that conversation. And it's so important to have a recovered sponsor to guide you through because they will tell you what you need to hear. Our mind will tell us what we want to hear. My mind will tell me that I had been hurt. My mind will tell me that my resentment is justified or that my fear is justified. My mind will tell me what I want to hear. And your sponsor is a spiritual advisor and will help you to see the truth. Now, ultimately, of course, it's like between you and God, and it's about this willingness to confront our defects, but that sponsor can be objective and can help explain this and help you to see the truth. And then step 6 and 7, and actually, I want to go to my big book because I was thinking about this. The third step prayer I love. So let me go back for a moment when I took my third step. And it's on page 63 in the big book. And it says, God, I offer myself to thee to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. Now, I want to fast forward to step 6 and 7 because we have more prayers. And step 6 is just about asking God for the willingness. And I find these on page 76 in my big book. And it says, if we still cling to something we will not let go, we ask God to help us be willing. So, whatever fear we're holding on to, whatever resentment, and that can be unique person to person. But there are things that we just want to hold on to, and we ask God for the willingness. And then step 7 is basically giving it over to our higher power. And this is the prayer. My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Amen. I look at step 6 and 7 like if you imagine you are holding on to something in a clenched fist. And, like if I have a rock in my fist and I'm just holding on to it, I'm going to give it to somebody else. But first, you have to relax your fingers. Like that's the willingness. And that's how I think of step 6, that I have to actually ask for the willingness. I have to relax my fingers around it and be willing to let go. And then step 7 is where we're handing our defects over to our higher power. We're asking God to take them. And that's where I'm actually going to hand that rock to the person. So you have to be willing to relax the hand, let go of the fingers, and then we pass it over. And that's what we're doing with our defects, because for as powerless as we are over the alcohol, and that includes, all the ways that we're impacted by it and how that shows up in our Al-Anonic way of thinking and our obsession and how we control the people and the relationships, we are powerless over our defects of character. Like I cannot, even when I see that I'm being selfish, I cannot wish that away. I saw that time and again through my life, where I saw that I was afraid, or I saw that I was being selfish, and I wanted to be a better person, or I wanted to make healthier choices, and I just couldn't. I just couldn't do that on my own power. And so we need God to be involved in that process. We need our higher power um, in order to grow and move forward. And again, we're not bad people, we're spiritually sick. And the whole inventory process is really straightforward. When we talk about selfishness and self-centeredness over and over again, we're not trying to beat ourselves up. And we are sensitive people. We take things very personally, and we get our feelings hurt. And this is not meant to beat ourselves up. It's just taking an honest look. Like if you have a little grocery store, you have to take an honest look at what's on the shelf. You have to look at whether the bread is stale or not. You have to look at whether the bananas are yellow or if they're brown. And you're just taking a very straightforward look at what you have. And that's how we approach these defects. We have to be willing to confront them. And also, think about your house. Like if you have a big old pile of mud on the floor, you can't clean it up without looking at it. You could try, but you're probably going to miss some and track things around the house. And so you have to, get down and look at where the mud is so you can wipe it up and clean up your floor. And that's how our defects are. That, maybe you can get by for a time without looking at those defects, but eventually they're probably going to get tracked all over your life. And so we do that inventory process, and then we need to make amends. And that's steps 8 and 9. Step 8 is making a list of people we've harmed, and we take those names from our inventories. That was pretty straightforward for me. And then, I also had other names come to mind, people who didn't necessarily show up on my inventory, but I knew I had harmed them. And I stuck them on my list for step 8. There were people I had harmed, for example, in how I was kind of pushy and controlling, how I thought I was doing the right thing, trying to like manage the world around me, but really I was stepping on toes. There were times that in my Al-Anonism, I would get so caught up in my head that I would then like isolate and withdraw, and I would put up these walls, and I just was not emotionally available to the people in my life when I should have been. And so in any case, I had these people I'd harmed, and I put them on a list, and step 9 was going out and making amends, that we try to clear up the wreckage of our past. And this could be a lifelong process. We're not meant to sit on this until all the amends are done. In my experience, it was a swift process, quick, rigorous action. It was like within a couple weeks, I was into the steps and through the steps, because I knew my mind was a ticking time bomb. If I had taken months and years to work through the steps, I would have wrecked my relationships. I needed to experience a psychic change when it came to my Al-Anonism. I needed to have this shift in perspective where I could see the world differently and see the people in my life differently. Um, and so I was willing to take rigorous action in order to work through this. Not, some people think it's rushing it. I wasn't rushing it, but I was being rigorous and thorough, and I was just launching into it. And I started making amends. And then I moved on to steps 10, 11, and 12. I continued to make amends as I went along. But making amends is different from apologizing. I was used to apologizing. My parents had taught me how to say, I'm sorry. What I had never learned before, what was totally just a new concept, was this idea of admitting wrongdoing and defects, expressing regret, but also asking for an action. This is what I've done, and it was selfish and inconsiderate. I regret the harm that's caused. How can I make it up to you? And then just listening and seeing what action is asked of us. It's very humbling. And it's also it's like a trust fall with God of whatever is said from the other person. We're just trusting that God is in that conversation. And when I make the amends, that I'm giving up the control over the outcomes. Because as an Al Anon, I really want the control. Like without a spiritual solution, I crave control in my life and I crave controlling other people because that's how I get my security. And in recovery, I'm giving that to my higher power, that I'm going to trust God with the outcomes of these amends. And we are told in the big book that sometimes things may not go well. Sometimes the other person we're making amends to, they might not receive it well, but that's okay. It's water under the bridge. Or we've done our part. We've done what we needed to do in making the attempt, and the rest is up to God. But in my experience, almost always has it gone well. I feel like I've repaired something by trying. And then steps 10, 11, and 12 are where I live on a daily basis. And step 10 is like a mini inventory of just staying spiritually fit on a daily basis by addressing things that bother me, that come up through the day, because we're not perfect and we never will be. And that's something that I've had to recognize in my Al-Anonism also, is that, I crave this perfection because, again, that's a form of control. And there's this obsession around trying to be perfect so people see me a certain way, so I can maintain my self-image and so that I don't feel vulnerable. But we're not perfect. We never will be. And this is about progress. And we progress by um, dealing with our defects as they come up every day throughout the day. So that means when we feel disturbed, we pause and connect with God. And I see now that anytime I'm disturbed, I'm disconnected from God. Even things that you would think, oh, that's a legitimate fear, or that's a legitimate resentment. Like you get in a car crash. Oh yeah, anybody would be afraid. Well, that may be so, but if I'm disturbed, I'm disconnected from God, because I know that if I'm connected with God, I can match calamity with serenity. I can match calamity with serenity if I'm connected with my higher power. So anytime I'm disturbed, no matter the cause, there's a disconnect. And that means when I'm being selfish, when I'm afraid, when I'm getting irritable, when I'm impatient, when I'm frustrated, anything, when I'm feeling disturbed, then I pause and I do a little mini inventory, and I think through, how am I being selfish in this situation, or what am I not considering? What's the fear? And this becomes more intuitive over time. In the beginning, we lean really heavily on the experience of our sponsors to guide us through and explain to us, how those defects are showing up and affecting us. But it does become more intuitive. As with anything you practice, you learn to play basketball, you learn to play the piano. It's like the more you practice, the more intuitive it becomes. You get the muscle memory. So I kind of get like the spiritual muscle memory of understanding what those defects are, but we share them with our sponsor. That's my practice. I take it to my sponsor because every once in a while I might have this little thought that, like I'm justified in being angry, or, I'm not seeing things clearly. And that's where sponsors objective can tell us what we need to hear. They can humble us. But we're asking God to remove those defects. We discuss them with our sponsor. We make amends if we need to. Ideally, we've kept our mouth shut. We ideally we haven't harmed other people, but it happens because we're not perfect. My examples are losing my temper with my husband or losing my temper with my children. It's those close, intimate relationships where we're sharing life day to day. And so it happens, and we just go and make amends, and we make things right if we need to, but we go help someone. So if we're having these moments where we're struggling, our job is to go out and be helpful, get our minds off of ourselves. Our problem is selfishness, thinking about ourselves. And so the solution ultimately, we're connecting with God and we have our sponsor, but then we are getting out of self. So there's that service component. And that's step 10. And some days I have a really good day. I might, every once in a while, I might not need to text my sponsor or call her. Often there's like maybe a couple things through the day that I need to address. Or maybe I'm having a hard day. Usually I find if my physical needs aren't met, like if I'm not taking care of myself properly, if I'm sleep deprived or whatever, like I get much more in my head and I get irritable, and I'm practicing step 10 more. But that's also a sign to me that I need to take care of myself, my body, because if my body's not doing well, then I'm not going to be useful to people around me. So, any case, all of that's to say that, each day is a new day, and we just practice, and we try to learn and grow. But then step 11 is prayer and meditation, where we're talking to God and listening. And it's like any relationship. You imagine in a friendship or with a spouse, that you have to have that dialogue. You're going to talk, but then you also have to take time to listen to get to know the person. And that's how I feel about my higher power, that I pray, but I also need to meditate to listen and try to hear God's inspiration. And that can be very difficult. And, especially our Al-Anon mind is like very busy. And we have all these thoughts that are racing through. And we just practice being still and silent and meditating. And then step 12 is the service component of trying to carry this message to other Al-Anons. And that means sharing our story, reaching out to newcomers, sharing on meetings, going into the community and telling people about Al-Anon, about 12-step programs, and just making ourselves available in that way. But step 12 also talks about practicing spiritual principles in all our affairs. And that means being patient, tolerant, kind, and loving in our families and the community and the workplace. Wherever we're going, we are trying to practice the spiritual way of life. And so I've been doing this for years now, kind of learning and growing and making mistakes and making amends, and just trying to progress. And I'll share briefly what my life is like now. I have greater clarity than ever how um, my life was affected by alcohol as a family illness, and how I have this Al-Anonic way of thinking. And but now I see where I used to be so obsessive about my relationships. I feel a lot of neutrality. I am able to show up and help when that's God's will, but I'm also able to just back off. I've had people in my life with issues. It's actually within the past year or so, it's come to our attention that my close family member is an alcoholic. And I think out of everybody in my family, I was able to be the most neutral. And that was definitely a God thing, like a sign of my recovery and stability. Because while everyone else was freaking out and trying to fix the alcoholic and trying to solve the problems, and they were worried, I was able to recognize that it's a serious issue, but also feel very neutral and have a very kind of fact finding attitude about it. And so for me, that was a blessing of the program. And there have been others in my life who it's been discovered since I've found recovery that they have different kind of substance issues or mental health issues. And this program keeps me so grounded. Um, so I can thank God for that. But I also want to mention friendships that throughout my life, I never felt authentic in my friendships because I was this actor. I had like a stage show of I would be the person that I thought other people wanted me to be. And consequently, I never felt like anybody knew me. And then I felt very lonely and isolated, and I felt set apart. And since working the 12 steps around my Al-Anonism and just, becoming more honest in my relationships, I've been able to be very authentic in my friendships and um, not get into the people pleasing and not get into the obsessive thinking and the controlling and managing. And so, with God's help, my friend, I have, for the first time in my life, really, I have these deep, heart level, authentic friendships. And my marriage, I'm still married. Like I got married and I'm still married. And I truly don't think that would be the case if I weren't living in recovery for my Al-Anonism, because um, by the time I came in for my Al-Anonism and, all the weird, like codependent, controlling, managing stuff I was doing, I was I was very fed up with my husband, and it was me. Like it was all me and it was all here in my mind. And we are healthy. We're healthier than we had ever been before. We have our moments where we butt heads and we get frustrated, but I have seen over the years how our communication has continued to improve. And we're getting more and more clarity around how to communicate with each other and trying to listen to each other. We're cueing into what the other needs in a healthy way. And it's through God's help. God does for me what I cannot do for myself. And God has helped me to have a healthy marriage and just grow in that. And thank God, not only for the sake of my husband and me, but for our children. We have two young children, and they're 3 and 5 years old. And I'm so grateful that they have only ever known a mother in recovery. And that's what I can pass on to them. Like, I'm not perfect, and sometimes I lose my temper and get impatient, but I have a spiritual solution. I know how to make things right. I'm grounded. And I'm so grateful that they can have that level of emotional stability where I'm not, um, I have my emotional sobriety as a result of working this program. So, anyways, lots of blessings, lots of miracles. It's incredible that through working a spiritual program, I am able to have relief from my Al-Anonic way of thinking and my behaviors, and I'm able to have neutrality in the relationships, including now these people who I found are active alcoholics, and I can just live life and I'm okay. And I know that God's going to handle it. So, with that, I think we'll go ahead and close up. In closing, our seventh tradition states every group ought to be fully self supporting, declining outside contributions. This group does not have a payment structure in place and currently has no overhead expenses. If you would like to fulfill Tradition 7, please send contributions directly to the Al-Anon World Service Office by visiting alanon.org. For questions about this meeting, or if you are looking for a sponsor, please send emails to alanonbigbookrecovery@gmail.com. Recordings can be accessed on YouTube by typing at Al-Anon Step Speaker in the YouTube search box, or on Spotify at Al-Anon Step Speaker Series. If you're interested in other Al-Anon meetings that follow the Big Book, please visit alanonbigbooksolution.group.org. Now let's have a moment of silence for the Al-Anon who still suffers, followed by the Lord's Prayer, or prayer of your own choosing, said in silence. Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And host, please enter the